During the Second World War, American light and medium tanks were known for their balanced characteristics. The Americans rarely indulged in excessive armor reinforcement, reasonably believing that one of the most important qualities of a tank was its high mobility. However, the idea of creating a vehicle with enhanced armor protection occasionally appealed to them as well. One such result was a specialized medium tank that became the most heavily armored among all serially produced medium tanks of the Second World War. Despite the limited number of vehicles built, this tank saw active combat use and proved itself to be a successful design. At the time of its debut, the American medium tank Sherman was among the best in the world. In terms of power-to-weight ratio, it surpassed German tanks produced in 1942. It featured a well-angled upper front glacis plate, which provided protection against penetration at medium ranges even from 2-inch caliber guns. The tank had excellent visibility and mounted a powerful 3-inch gun, which, as it turned out, was capable of penetrating the side armor of the German heavy tank Tiger from a distance of several hundred feet. The vehicle did have its shortcomings. Its armor quality was not the best. According to research conducted in the Soviet Union, it was inferior to Soviet armor, and there were complaints regarding its large overall dimensions and the precision of its aiming devices. During serial production, some of Sherman's flaws were corrected. However, with the increasing caliber of German tank and anti-tank artillery, the frontal armor no longer met modern battlefield requirements by early 1943. During a modernization of the hull carried out in the second half of 1943, the thickness of the upper front plate was increased to 2.5 inches, though this came at the cost of a reduced angle of slope. The side armor thickness was increased to 1.5 inches. Any further increase in armor protection was deemed impractical, as it would have raised the load on the suspension system unevenly, leading to excessive stress on the front road wheels and a sharp reduction in their service life. Nevertheless, work to improve Sherman's armor protection continued. One of the most vulnerable elements of the tank was the transmission housing. Hits to this unit were a frequent occurrence, and thus it received the closest attention. Various methods of reinforcing the housing's resistance were tested, including the development of a welded structure. However, each of these solutions introduced a new problem known as low manufacturability. In addition to improving protection, it was also necessary to maintain production simplicity at an acceptable level. The first step toward improving the design was the creation of a one-piece transmission housing, previously made of 3 parts. In May 1943, the Aberdeen Proving Ground developed several types of armor skirts for the transmission housing, though these designs never entered production. The solution was finally found during the aforementioned hull modernization. A new housing design was created that preserved as much as possible the same angle of slope as the upper frontal armor. At the same time, the housing was made with variable thickness, from 2 to 4.25 inches. As a result, its resistance increased significantly, although it still could not fully protect against armor-piercing shells of 3-inch caliber. In any case, the problem was at least partially resolved. One more interesting solution was the development of additional armor in February 1944. The idea was simple. Special plates were made at the factories for the front of the hull and the turret that significantly increased protection. On February 24th, Chrysler prepared a wooden mock-up of such protection. It covered the front of the hull, the turret, and partially the sides, and also the gun itself. But the program to produce that additional armor was shut down just as quickly as it had been launched. The reason was simple. The leadership began to understand the price that would have to be paid. The extra weight at the front did nothing to increase the longevity of the running gear. Nevertheless, in less than 1 year, very similar armor kits, although improvised, began to appear on the front in large numbers. Everyone wanted to survive, and commanders often turned a blind eye to such improvised armor, and more often they themselves initiated its installation. It frequently weighed even more than Chrysler's design. Interestingly, the trigger for these modifications was a completely standard production vehicle with reinforced armor. Before experimenting with strengthening the protection of their own tanks, the Americans developed an assault tank. This vehicle was ordered by the British and was a heavily modified medium Sherman. Although the hull and turret design turned out to be quite successful and satisfied the customer, the project failed. The vehicle proved to be much less reliable than the original Sherman, especially with regard to the running gear. In addition, the combat weight reached 94,000 pounds, which was significantly more than the weight of a standard Sherman. Even reworking the running gear did not help. Based on the results of proving ground tests that ran until November 1943, the assault tank was declared an unsuccessful design. At the same time, the very idea of creating a more mobile analog of the infantry tank appealed to the American military. The other issue was that the idea of creating a largely new tank was rejected, as was increasing the weight to such large magnitudes. The American concept of an assault tank was more down to earth, but easier to implement. The basis was the medium Sherman with the most powerful engine available. The turret was then reinforced, as were the front and side plates of the hull. According to calculations, the chassis could be loaded up to 82,000 pounds naturally after strengthening the running gear. Thus, there remained approximately 16,000 pounds of armor in reserve. To test the theory, on December 17, 1943, the General Motors Proving Ground was tasked with re-equipping one of the medium Sherman tanks. The tank was additionally loaded with ballast in the form of welded steel plates on the glacis and sides of the hull. In addition, extra weight was added to the movable armor of the gun mantlet. Because the mass increased to 82,000 pounds, the tracks were fitted with wideners. The re-equipped tank ran 500 miles without any serious breakdowns being detected. Thus, the possibility of creating an assault tank based on a production vehicle opened up. As a result of the tests, a program to create the assault tank was launched, as well as the above-described development of add-on armor for the medium Sherman. The second direction was quickly closed because of the already described problems of overloading the nose. As for the special assault tank, preliminary drawing documentation was prepared by March 2, 1944. After studying it, the Armaments Committee recommended adopting the tank into service. A production run of 254 vehicles was also planned. An interesting point, initially this modification was designated experimental, but in less than 1 year, other Sherman modifications entered serial production and were produced by the thousands. By the time the assault version of the tank was approved, the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Detroit had already begun producing a new modification of the Sherman. These tanks received modernized hulls with a redesigned front section and reinforced transmission protection. The combat weight increased to 69,700 pounds. This weight gain naturally affected the assault version as well. The limit for additional armor reinforcement became lower, though the upper threshold was raised to 83,800 pounds. In addition, starting from March 1944, the Fisher plant began producing another version of the tank, with a new turret borrowed from the medium tank. The tank itself was unsuccessful, but the turret proved suitable since it had the same ring diameter. With minimal changes, it was mounted on the chassis, resulting in a more spacious fighting compartment and a new, more powerful gun. This turret was ultimately chosen for the assault tank. The contract for producing the assault Sherman also went to the Fisher Tank Arsenal, which was entirely logical. The vehicle entered production without a prototype. The design was based on a standard Sherman fitted with the new turret and the old 75mm gun. The less powerful gun was chosen because the main role of the assault tank was to provide direct infantry support. The hulls for the assault version were the same as those used for standard tanks. The difference lay in the armor protection. The thickness of the upper glacis plate increased to 4 inches, though it was not a single solid plate, but rather an additional layer of armor. Over the standard 2.5-inch plate, another 1.5-inch plate was added. The same applied to the hull sides. They received an extra 1.5-inch layer, bringing the total thickness to 3 inches. The additional armor was placed only on the upper side plates, with no protection added to the suspension. The strongest protection was given to the transmission housing. This cast component had an armor thickness ranging from 4.5 to 5.5 inches. No other serial medium tank of the Second World War had such protection. The turrets, however, posed a greater challenge. Unlike the hull, it was impossible to simply weld extra plates onto them, so they had to be cast from scratch. Externally, the turret remained similar to that of the medium tank. Unlike the first turret versions, the loader's hatch, which previously took the form of the Sherman's commander's cupola, was replaced with a standard oval hatch. The loader also regained his periscopic sight, which had been removed earlier. The turret of the assault Sherman became noticeably cheekier due to the reinforced armor. the side thickness increased to 6 inches, the same as on the front and rear. The thickest part was the movable gun mantlet armor, reaching 7 inches. The 75mm gun was installed in a slightly modified mount, originally designed for a more powerful weapon. The modified mount received a new designation, though in reality the differences were minimal, something that later proved very useful. The contract for producing the turrets was awarded to 2 plants, Union Steel and Ordnance Steel Foundry. Their turrets differed in the shape of the cast body. At Ordnance Steel Foundry, the lower edges of the turret were sharp, with distinct facets, while at Union Steel, these areas appeared more rounded. Some tanks also received flat tracks instead of the chevron type. These were mostly the vehicles from the later production batches. The combat weight of the production M4A3E2 rose from the original 37.5 tons to 38.1 tons, about 84,000 pounds. Such a significant increase in weight naturally affected the tank's speed. The transmission was retuned, reducing the maximum road speed to 22 miles per hour. That was slightly less than that of the assault tank T-14, but everyone understood this machine was not meant for fast cavalry attacks. Reliability came first, and it was worth sacrificing some speed for it. In return, the vehicle achieved a protection level comparable to the British Churchill 7, and in terms of turret front armor, it even surpassed the English infantry tank. However, the Ordnance Department did not have a unanimous opinion about the tank's prospects, so they first decided to test an initial trial batch before drawing conclusions about further production. The contract began in May 1944. During the first month, the Fisher Tank Arsenal delivered 40 tanks, 110 in June, and the remaining 104 in July. The first production tank was sent on May 19th to the Chrysler Tank Laboratory, where it underwent initial testing. Those tests confirmed that the previous trials with a ballasted tank conducted at the end of 1943 and the beginning of 1944 had been quite accurate. After 400 miles of driving, one suspension spring broke on one of the front bogies. Overall, the tank's reliability was considered fully comparable to the lighter production M4A375W. However, due to the increased load on the front, drivers had to be more careful off-road to avoid damaging the suspension of the leading road wheels. Later, the tank was sent to Fort Knox for additional tests, which it passed successfully. The first live fire trials of the M4A3E2 took place in May 1944, followed by more in August and September, after production had already ceased. Interestingly, the tank was fired upon with a 90mm gun, more powerful than the 88mm German guns for which its armor had originally been designed. Most likely, this simulated fire from the most powerful gun available to the Germans at that time. Naturally, the tank was not built to withstand such firepower, yet in several cases, shells failed to penetrate at a distance of 3,000 feet. The most resilient part turned out to be the movable gun mantlet armor. It was not penetrated even from 1,800 feet. The tests once again confirmed that the armor protection was at a very respectable level, especially compared to other American tanks. Out of the 254 M4A3E2 tanks produced, only 4 never saw combat, including the first production vehicle. Initially, 252 tanks were to be sent to the front, but on September 10, 1944, that number was reduced by 2. It is worth noting that the tank appeared at the front quite quickly. The troops were in urgent need of such vehicles. The first units to receive them were part of the First Army. On October 14, 1944, the 743rd, 745th, and 746th Tank Battalions received their tanks. In total, the First Army obtained 100 of these machines. Starting on November 22nd, the M4A3E2 began arriving to units of the Third Army. The 702nd, 712th, 735th, 737th, and 761st Tank Battalions, as well as the 10th Armored Division. In total, 60 tanks went to the Third Army. Finally, on November 27th, deliveries began to the 9th Army, with the 747th Tank Battalion being the first to receive them. Altogether, the 9th Army received 90 of these thickly armored machines. Among the units of the Third Army that received the new tanks was the 6th Armored Division. It was with this division that the nickname, which after the war became permanently associated with this reinforced Sherman, was born. November 22, 1944, near the French town of Saint-Jean-Rohrbach, One of the tanks from Company B slipped into a wide ditch and rolled onto its side. The moment was captured in a photograph, and the author labeled the vehicle as a Jumbo M4 tank. Jumbo was the name of the first widely known circus elephant. Why exactly the photographer chose that name is unclear. Perhaps the overturned tank reminded him of the famous image of the elephant killed by a train. Whatever the reason, the nickname Jumbo began with that photograph. It was never used in official documents and likely only became common after the war. As often happens with brand new equipment, the combat debut of the reinforced Sherman was not entirely successful. One of the first to go into battle was the 743rd Tank Battalion, operating alongside the 30th Infantry Division. In November 1944, the battalion crossed the border between the Netherlands and Germany. That was where the first irrecoverable loss occurred. On November 16th, during the battle for Würselen, one tank was destroyed by fire from a German Panzerfaust anti-tank launcher. On the 22nd, the battalion fought near Neulohn, losing 2 more tanks. One of them took at least 10 hits, one of which proved fatal. A shell struck directly into the opening of the telescopic sight, pierced the gun mantlet, and killed the gunner. 2 more crew members were wounded, and the explosion inside the tank tore off the turret. The second vehicle was also hit several times, with a side penetration being fatal. By December 3, 1944, total irrecoverable losses of the reinforced Shermans across all units reached 10 vehicles. Altogether, the formations had 154 tanks, 129 directly in units, 74 in transit, and 12 awaiting shipment to the United States. Despite these losses, the assault tanks received high praise from their crews. The strong frontal armor plate proved invaluable. These machines could withstand hits that would have destroyed a regular Sherman. For that reason, nearly every unit that operated a Jumbo began sending requests along the lines of, "Send us more of these tanks." Naturally, the increased protection came at a cost to reliability. Complaints about damage to suspension and transmission components were more frequent than with regular Shermans. Yet the armor was considered more important. It became clear that an infantry support tank was also needed in regular armored units. These vehicles were often placed at the head of columns since they could survive most enemy shell impacts. With the Jumbo, American tankers finally had a vehicle that, in most cases, could resist 88mm shells. Because of their limited production numbers, Jumbos were often distributed in small quantities, sometimes just 3 or 4 tanks per unit. However, by early 1945, it had become clear that the assault tank was a success. Still, there were some objections. The original idea that this tank would serve exclusively as infantry support turned out to be incorrect. Armored divisions also demanded and received them. For example, the 4th Armored Division had the largest number, with 20 vehicles by the end of December 1944. There, officers doubted that a 75mm gun was sufficient for such a vehicle and requested that it be fitted with a 76mm weapon. The demands of American tankers were summarized in a letter dated January 31, 1945, written by General Dwight Eisenhower to the War Department. The letter emphasized the urgent need to deliver as many new Jumbos as possible, since they had proven their worth. The only proposed modification was the installation of 76mm guns. Later came an additional request for a reinforced suspension capable of carrying greater weight. The reality was that the American war machine did not work as expected. An idea emerged to further strengthen the armament by mounting the turret of a heavy tank onto the chassis of a medium assault tank. Later, this concept was even brought to life as a prototype, but by then the situation had already changed. A new program was launched to enhance the armor protection of the heavy tank. The result could be summed up in the phrase, "They wanted the best, but it turned out as always." Instead of urgently producing more improved assault tanks, they began developing an entirely new vehicle. Naturally, this innovation did not reach the front lines in time and even suffered from issues with its running gear. The sluggishness of the American military system could also be seen in how the assault tank was equipped. Despite repeated requests from the field not to install dust shields, they continued to be fitted until the very end. In combat units, these shields were quickly removed, which is why photographs of these tanks with the screens in place are extremely rare. To some extent, the slowness of American industry was offset by the work of field workshops. Once it became clear that additional armor was effective and that new assault tanks were not forthcoming, the crews began reinforcing regular tanks with extra armor plates. How this affected the running gear and transmission was of little concern. Protection had become the top priority. Incidentally, even the assault tanks themselves were reinforced in some units. Sandbags appeared on the front hull, which proved effective against German anti-tank grenade launchers. Naturally, the bags did nothing to improve mobility, but everyone wanted to survive, and unit commanders did not forbid such modifications. Thanks to the field workshops, the issue of armament was also partially solved. In February 1945, a system was developed for rearming tanks equipped with 75mm guns to 76mm ones. After discussion, it was decided not to rearm tanks with standard turrets for the same reason as back in early 1943. The fighting compartment was too cramped. However, approval was given to rearm the assault tanks. Since the turret, as mentioned earlier, was only a slightly modified version of a design originally meant for the 76mm gun, the rearmament process posed no major difficulties. In total, about 100 tanks were converted to 76mm guns. Depending on the workshop that performed the modification, the armor of the gun mantelet differed. In some cases, it remained unchanged, while in others, the protrusion was cut off. Interestingly, by the late 1940s, some regular tanks were also refitted with 76mm guns. The success of the assault tank concept can be seen in a single number. From November to May 1945, only 61 assault tanks were irretrievably lost, just over 1/5 of the total. And this despite the fact that these vehicles were constantly at the forefront of advancing units. It is astonishing how short-sighted the American military leadership turned out to be. Instead of continuing production of a successful vehicle, it launched a confusing program to develop new designs that ultimately arrived too late for combat. As for the later fate of the assault tank, it never fought again. In the early 1950s, around 100 vehicles were modernized, and from 1957 onward, they were rapidly decommissioned. Fewer than 10 tanks of this type have survived to the present day, including the famous assault tank bearing the name Cobra King, which was the first to break into Bastogne during the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes.